A serial rapist strikes in a suburb outside Toronto, Canada.
The nature of the beatings, what the victims had endured, clearly told us that we're dealing with a sexually sadistic offender.
Years later, a serial killer brutally targets young girls in another Canadian town.
It was gruesome. Who could kill a young teenage girl and dismember her body?
Fear sweeps southern Ontario. The bloody trail leads police to a pair of unlikely suspects, a young, beautiful married couple.
Our battalion has distinguished itself.
The idea that these were the bad guys, that they were capable of doing anything so vile, is something that's hard for us to comprehend.
She assaulted her sister. It was absolutely mind-boggling.
It's the most sensational and probably one of the most sinister cases in Canadian history.
Saturday the 29th of June 1991, at a quiet recreational area near the town of St. Catharines in Ontario, Canada, some fishermen made a horrifying discovery. At one end of Lake Gibson, they noticed several concrete blocks partially submerged in the water. They took a closer look and were shocked to find what appeared to be pieces of human flesh protruding from the cracks. Niagara Regional Police searched the murky waters for more evidence. They found a total of 8 concrete blocks, each contained body parts.
We believe the party to be a female, young female. It could be between 14 to 24 years of age.
The victim was identified as 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey from the nearby town of Burlington. She'd been missing for 2 weeks. The same day her body was found, a young couple exchanged wedding vows 16 miles away in the quaint town of Niagara-on-the-Lake. Their fairy tale wedding was complete with a horse-drawn carriage.
At face value, it was a beautiful wedding, but if you talk to the friends and the relatives, everybody knew that it was just a big charade.
21-year-old Karla Homolka and 26-year-old Paul Bernardo appeared to be the perfect couple, but friends and family suspected Paul had been unfaithful. What they didn't know was far worse. The 16th of April 1992, less than a year after Paul and Karla's wedding, 15-year-old Kristen French went missing from her hometown of St. Catharines. 2 weeks later, on the 30th of April, her parents' worst fears were realized. A man searching for scrap metal found the body of their daughter in a ditch on the side of the road in Burlington. Kristen had been sexually assaulted, beaten and strangled. Her body was dumped less than a quarter of a mile from the cemetery where Leslie Mahaffey had been buried a year earlier. The police consulted FBI profiler Greg McCreary. They suspected there could be a connection between the two murders.
Those crimes are very unusual, to abduct and murder young women. And there was a sort of a polarization here. One was abducted in Burlington and the body was in St. Catharines. The other was abducted in St. Catharines and the body was found in Burlington. It sort of connected the crimes geographically at that point.
The location of the bodies and the viciousness of the attacks led police to suspect this was the work of an experienced killer.
This was no kid that was just starting a criminal career. This is somebody who had developed a degree of criminal sophistication over the years.
The police also believed that the culprit might have an accomplice after eyewitnesses reported seeing the victim talking to 2 people just before she disappeared.
Is this correct? Is that
what no one could imagine is that the police would eventually link the crimes to these young, good-looking newlyweds.
Our battalion has distinguished itself, but only 120 men are left.
They were attractive looking, they were intelligent, they were in love. The idea that these were the bad guys, that they were capable of doing anything so vile, is something that's hard for us to comprehend.
Paul and Karla would eventually be linked not only to the murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, but also the killing of Karla's own sister and the rapes of more than a dozen other women in southern Ontario. Their story would generate headlines around the world about the systematic failure of the police to catch them and the couple's intense obsession with each other. When Karla Homolka first met Paul Bernardo, she was a 17-year-old high school student working part-time in a pet shop. Paul was 23, training to be an accountant, and would soon graduate from the University of Toronto.
Say, look, is this correct? Is that the right place?
The 17th of October 1987, Karla was attending a pet food convention in the town of Scarborough, outside Toronto.
120 men are left out of 900.
She and a colleague were having a late-night snack in a hotel restaurant when Paul walked in.
As soon as Paul Bernardo walked in the door and laid eyes on Karla Homolka, there was, as the friends describe it, there was electricity in the air. It was love at first sight, or lust at first sight, whatever you want to call it.
Paul was over 6 feet tall with boyish good looks and a captivating charm. Karla was immediately attracted to his handsome appearance and outgoing personality. Within hours, they were in her hotel room having sex.
My sense is that Karla was extremely insecure and was looking for a strong man.
Their intense mutual attraction would eventually spiral out of control with horrific consequences.
They call it a match made in heaven, but in this case it was clearly a match made in hell.
Karla believed 23-year-old Paul was the man of her dreams, but he was a man with dark secrets, and she was a young woman who would do anything for him. The eldest of 3 daughters, Karla Homolka was a popular and pretty girl. She grew up in St. Catharines, on the southern shore of Lake Ontario. In high school, Karla had several boyfriends, but none quite like Paul Bernardo. He was 6 years her senior, and in her mind, the perfect catch. She bragged to friends about his maturity and good looks, and Paul was quite taken with Karla too.
It was a perfect match for Bernardo. He'd found his soulmate. He'd found the woman who would do anything. And ultimately she did do anything.
The youngest of 3 children, Paul was a good-looking boy with dimples and a sweet smile. But behind the happy expression was a little boy who'd had a difficult childhood. His mother was verbally abusive. His father, Paul discovered, was not his biological parent, something Paul only found out when he was 16. Around that time, Paul began peeping through his female neighbours' windows as they undressed. As he grew older, his voyeurism gradually mutated into something more aggressive.
It would appear there's something very different in terms of his sexual makeup. From what I can glean, he wasn't necessarily a man who was terribly aroused by consenting sexual activity.
Paul Bernardo tried to keep his sexual tendencies hidden. In September 1983, he began studying at the University of Toronto in Scarborough. By all accounts, he was well liked by friends and neighbours.
One of the most horrifying things is that he seems so normal. I believe that this is quite common in psychopathic personalities. They are often very charming, entertaining, life of the party kind of people.
He had several girlfriends in college who said they broke up with him when their sexual relationships became abusive.
He'd become fixated almost on violence towards women and on conquering women, on going to discos and bars and getting them and having sex with them and getting them to do whatever he wanted.
In the spring of 1988, a sexual predator was roaming the streets of Scarborough. By May, there'd been 7 attacks on women.
We're supposed to warn women not to travel alone at night.
The attacker would grab women as they got off a bus or walked through a park, pulling them behind bushes where he'd sexually assault them. At first, these attacks consisted of groping, but over a 13-month period, the assaults grew more violent. The media dubbed the attacker the Scarborough Rapist. His victims were forced to perform intercourse, oral sex and sodomy, and were sometimes beaten.
Everybody knew about the Scarborough Rapist. Everybody was on their guard. And it was a nightmare for many young women. And it was a real nightmare for the women who unfortunately happened to be pounced on by him.
The Metropolitan Toronto Police Department took statements from the victims. But they couldn't get an accurate description. The women had been attacked from behind and couldn't see the rapist's face clearly. All they could say was that he was young and good-looking with light-coloured hair. Police found another common characteristic among the attacks. The attacker forced his victims to call themselves degrading names such as slut.
Nobody had a clue who the Scarborough rapist was. The Toronto police were working diligently on the case. They'd taken as many as, I believe, 100 DNA samples from potential suspects.
In the autumn of 1988, the Toronto police called in FBI profiler Greg McCreary to assist in the search for the Scarborough rapist. Over the next several months, McCreary analysed police reports and was able to link 4 more attacks to the Scarborough rapist, bringing the total up to 11.
This was a very dangerous subtype of rapist that was very anger-based, perhaps even sadistic in nature. They're rare, but they're very, very dangerous offenders.
McCreary's concerns grew as the assaults became more serious.
Not only were these women being brutalized, but we felt we're on the verge of perhaps this thing moving over the line into homicide, and that's what had everybody's attention.
When one sees a serial rapist, there is a high probability that they're being driven by a sexual drive that's been misdirected, and that they are going to continue to be driven in that fashion unless we intervene through catching them.
Special Agent McCreary developed a profile of the person he thought police should be looking for.
We felt this was more of a high-functioning, intelligent, psychopathic, sexually sadistic sort of offender. And he lives in the Scarborough area in a dependent situation, probably with family members. Early 20s, has a violent relationship with women, even women that he's in a relationship with.
When Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka first met in the autumn of 1987, there had already been 3 attacks linked to the Scarborough rapist. Karla never suspected the man she was falling in love with was linked to these brutal crimes.
I want to go there and say, look, is this correct?
At first, Paul Bernardo showered her with flowers, with gifts, and treated her really well. He was a considerate person. He was a considerate lover. He was a nice guy. And she flaunted him something fierce.
Paul and Karla's relationship quickly intensified, both physically and emotionally. Over the next 18 months, Paul drove to St. Catharines to visit Karla several times a week, an 80-mile trip. Our family adored him and weren't concerned by their 6-year age difference. Like 19-year-old Karla, her parents thought Paul was a great catch. In the spring of 1989, Karla graduated from high school. By autumn that year, Karla was telling friends that Paul had been verbally abusing her, but she was always quick to forgive him. That December, Paul and Karla took a romantic trip to Niagara Falls. There he asked her to marry him. She eagerly accepted. To her parents, he seemed like an excellent choice of husband.
He was good looking, he had ambitions to be a rap singer. He'd been trained as an accountant, had a degree from the University of Toronto. Certainly he had all the credentials to be a dream son-in-law.
They planned to marry in the spring of 1991. On the 29th of May 1990, police released a composite sketch of the Scarborough rapist to the media.
The composite sketch came out about the time we were doing the profile. One of the victims got a pretty good look.
When the sketch was publicized, friends of Paul Bernardo were stunned by what they saw.
Paul Bernardo's best friends had in fact contacted Toronto police and said, this artist's concept is a ringer for Paul Bernardo.
During the summer of 1990, a serial rapist was terrorizing the Toronto suburb of Scarborough. Police released a composite sketch of the suspect. Metropolitan Toronto police stations were flooded with calls. The man accused of more than a dozen sexual assaults in the Scarborough area bore a strong resemblance to Paul Bernardo. By November 1990, several people, including Bernardo's own friends, had given his name to the police after seeing the composite sketch. The police brought him in for questioning and requested a DNA sample. The sample was sent to the Centre of Forensic Sciences in Toronto, where it was put on a shelf with hundreds of other samples awaiting testing.
Keep in mind that DNA still, even at that time, was relatively new. It isn't what it is today. There's all sorts of different technology today that we can get DNA readings very, very quickly.
Around the time Paul was questioned by the police, he moved from Scarborough to St. Catharines. He and his fiancée, Karla Homolka, lived with her parents until they could get a place of their own. The sexual assaults in Scarborough suddenly stopped, but a rash of incidents began to occur in the St. Catharines area. Karla and her family never suspected Paul. They adored him, especially Karla's 15-year-old sister, Tammy, who looked up to him like a big brother. But soon she became the target of his deviant urges.
Secretly, he wasn't just the brother that she'd never had. He was also, ogling her and salivating over her, and she was the virgin that Karla wasn't.
Paul began to pressure Karla for the one thing she was unable to give him.
While Karla wasn't a virgin, the closest person to her who was a virgin was her youngest sister, Tammy.
Desperately wanting to please Paul, Karla agreed to drug her younger sister so Paul could have sex with her.
Part of her reasoning is that she'll give him Tammy's virginity in place of her own.
It would be Karla's Christmas present to her fiancé. The 23rd of December 1990, after the rest of the Homolka family had gone to bed, Paul and Karla invited Tammy to stay up and have a few cocktails. Tammy didn't know that her drinks had been laced with sleeping pills purchased by Karla.
She used an animal tranquilizer in order to keep her sedated, while the two of them participated in this rape.
Karla used another drug stolen from the veterinary clinic where she worked to keep her sister unconscious. She soaked a rag with the drug halothane and held it over her sister's face while Paul raped the young girl. They videotaped the entire episode. All this happened while the rest of the family slept upstairs.
Most people videotape their family holidays and their children's first, second, third, and so on birthday. But he liked to videotape, in his eyes, his sexual conquest.
Paul then ordered Karla to assault her own sister.
On videotape, Paul rapes her, and so does Karla. Have sex with her own sister.
But the plan turned deadly. After Karla had raped her sister, Tammy began to vomit and choked. Paul and Karla quickly dressed her, hid the camera, and called an ambulance. When paramedics arrived, the couple said they tried to revive Tammy after she'd passed out from drinking. Tammy was taken to the hospital, where in the early hours of Christmas Eve, she was pronounced dead.
It never crossed anybody's mind that her own sister had participated in the killing.
Although doctors found a mysterious burn mark on Tammy's face where Karla had held the halothane-soaked rag, they concluded that she died of natural causes. Paul and Karla claimed the mark was a rock burn caused by their attempt to revive Tammy. Karla's parents viewed the death of the youngest child as a tragic accident, something that could happen to any teenager.
Everybody kind of took it at face value, so to speak, and wow, accidental death. Kids do drugs, kids drink. How unfortunate, how tragic.
A month later, Karla and Paul moved out of the Homolka house and into their own home. They moved into this two-story bungalow in Port Dalhousie, a small town near St. Catharines. From the outside, they appeared to be a perfect couple, but behind closed doors, Paul began to turn his aggression on Karla. He teased Karla that he was the Scarborough rapist and began physically abusing her. Any thoughts Karla had of leaving Paul were diminished by her insecurities and fear that he would tell her parents about her involvement in Tammy's death.
In this particular case, we have a man who is a serial rapist who meets up with a woman who ultimately ends up participating in further acts of sexual abuse, and ones that are even far more serious.
Paul Bernardo had given a DNA sample to the police more than 2 months earlier, but it still hadn't been tested.
Anytime offenders come into contact with the police and they don't end up in handcuffs, they're emboldened. They think they're better, smarter than the police.
The 15th of June, 1991. 2 weeks before Karla's dream wedding, Paul woke her in the middle of the night with a surprise. A young girl, 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey. He'd abducted Leslie from her own backyard, luring the teenager into his car with a cigarette. Together, the couple held the young girl captive in their home repeatedly assaulting her and recording the attacks on video. After less than 24 hours, they strangled her, cut up her body, and encased the pieces in concrete blocks, before dumping them in nearby Lake Gibson. It was 2 weeks before their wedding.
Well, clearly the relationship between Paul and Karla was a very destructive one. These are two people that fed into one another and encouraged and supported one another, would appear, in doing things that were just, in some sense, unspeakable.
On the 29th of June, 1991, Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka exchanged wedding vows before more than 100 friends and family members. On the same day as their fairy tale wedding, fishermen discovered the dismembered body of 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey, encased in concrete blocks. The details of the young girl's murder sent shockwaves through the region.
It was gruesome. I mean, when you imagine not only who could kill a young teenage girl, but who could dismember her body, dispose of it in such an ugly and heinous way. There was this massive veil of fear right across southern Ontario.
Over the next year, the Niagara Regional Police attempted to find any clues that would lead them to the teenager's killer. They called in FBI profiler Greg McCreary to assist with the investigation. McCreary had been asked to help with the Scarborough rapist case more than 2 years earlier. But he had no reason to believe those rapes were connected to the murder of Leslie Mahaffey. Nor did Toronto police make the connection to the rash of incidents in St. Catharines, so that information was not brought to McCreary's attention.
I wish I had made that connection. I had no idea there were other rapes going on up there at the time either. Had I known that, I don't know, maybe that would have clicked for me.
While the Niagara Regional Police searched for Leslie's murderer, Karla Homolka settled into her role as a wife. But she soon found that marriage had not quenched her new husband's thirst for virgins. In fact, Paul's deviant sexual demands escalated.
After they were married, Paul demanded that Karla get some of her sister, Tammy's best friends, around to the house because he wanted to drug them in the same way that they drugged Tammy.
Over the next year, Karla enticed several young girls into their home. The newlyweds drugged and sexually assaulted them. But unlike Karla's sister, Tammy, these girls survived, regaining consciousness with no memory of the assaults. Some of the attacks were videotaped.
He was obsessed with making himself into a star. It was very important for him to keep trophies or mementos that would confirm how successful he had been on these occasions.
With Karla's knowledge, Paul continued to stalk women throughout the Niagara region. On the 16th of April 1992, Paul and Karla went for an afternoon drive with the intent of bringing home a new sex slave. They were only a few miles from their own house when they spotted 15-year-old Kristen French walking home from school. They pulled into a church car park and waited for the girl to pass.
Karla was sitting in the passenger seat of Paul's Nissan, and she said to Kristen French, "Excuse me, could you help us with directions?" And she had a map out, and poor Kristen had no idea what was about to happen to her.
The couple shoved Kristen into their car and drove the short distance back to their Port Dalhousie home. It wasn't long before Kristen French was reported missing. Local police began to investigate.
We have no doubt from eyewitnesses that Kristen was abducted from that parking lot.
Witnesses told police they'd seen the girl with 2 people in the church car park. They also reported seeing the 3 drive away in a beige Camaro. In response to public fear about an attacker on the prowl, the Niagara Regional Police put together a team of investigators called the Green Ribbon Task Force. They examined eyewitness accounts about a beige Camaro and contacted Special Agent Greg McCreary.
It was a big hunt for this beige Camaro. Eyewitnesses were rock solid about seeing this beige Camaro.
Police did not know at the time that this was a false lead. Paul Bernardo drove a gold Nissan.
It's always a dilemma for law enforcement because we know eyewitness identification. It's been shown time and time again to be faulty. But you've got people witnessing the abduction and describing the car. You've got to go look for that car.
The media began to link the disappearance of Kristen French to that of Leslie Mahaffey 1 year earlier.
I'd been a reporter for maybe 15 years at the time, and all of my instinct, all of my experience told me that this was really bad, that this was going to be a major, major story.
Kristen's father appeared at a press conference, offering words of hope to his only daughter, should she be watching.
We want to know that we are thinking of you and that everything can be done is being done. And we'll get you back real quick.
Greg McCrary developed a profile of the suspect.
I described him as being a white male in his late 20s, probably with a history of sexually violent crimes, a history of domestic violence. He would beat his domestic partners.
Based on eyewitness reports that there were 2 offenders, McCrary hoped that he could get through to one of them.
If we can drive a wedge in between them, is likely to be a falling out, and we would like to very much be able to facilitate that.
Paul and Karla kept Kristen French for several days, raping and beating her. They videotaped the assaults to add to their collection. Finally, they strangled her. On the 30th of April 1992, Kristen's body was found. Paul Bernardo had left the body of the St. Catherine's teenager more than 30 miles away, in the neighbouring town of Burlington. Her body was discovered in a ditch near the cemetery where Leslie Mahaffey was buried. The authorities attempted to link the 2 cases, while local media fed the public's hunger.
I mean, we covered it extensively, probably more than any other paper, but there was an audience and an appetite for that.
As the hunt for a possible serial killer monopolized the news, Paul and Karla's relationship became even more violent. In January 1993, Paul beat Karla so severely that she sought treatment in an emergency room. Around the same time, the DNA samples collected more than 2 years earlier in the Scarborough rapist case were finally processed. After sorting through hundreds of samples, Paul Bernardo was identified as the man responsible for the Scarborough rapes. He was now living 18 miles away in Port Dalhousie, where Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey had been murdered.
That was a moment where I was both excited and frustrated. They had identified Paul Bernardo now as being the Scarborough rapist, and then he had moved into this area and became prime suspect, I mean #1 suspect in this case.
Bernardo had originally been identified and questioned based on a composite sketch of the Scarborough rapist more than 2 years earlier. At that time, he'd also given a DNA sample.
I think he was more brazen and more aggressive than ever, thinking that for whatever reason he'd beaten the system.
After investigators connected the cases, reporter Alan Cairns got the police tip of a lifetime.
The guy said, pull your Scarborough rapist files. And I remember, no, it's the Kristen French murder. And Leslie Mahaffey murder, he said, pull your Scarborough rapist guy files. It's the same guy. And I was stunned. Huge, huge story.
January 1993, Port Dalhousie, Ontario. Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka had a violent fight, landing her in hospital with severe injuries. Paul had attacked Karla with a torch, leaving her with 2 black eyes, a broken rib, and severe bruising. After less than 2 years of marriage, she decided to move out. Around the same time, Toronto police contacted Karla to discuss the DNA results of the Scarborough rapist case. After more than a 2-year delay, officials had identified her husband, Paul Bernardo, as the Scarborough rapist. Police suspected there might be some connection to the murders of Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey, but had few leads. To question Karla, they brought along members of the Green Ribbon Task Force, the team investigating the murders of the girls.
She thought to interview her about the domestic assault. In my opinion, they handled that interview exactly right because they didn't accuse her, they didn't overstep the bounds, but just by having Green Ribbon Task Force investigators there, that message was being communicated to her.
After her interview with the authorities, Karla broke down and confessed everything to her family. She was afraid the police already knew or were close to discovering the couple's terrible crimes. On her parents' advice, Karla hired a lawyer and told him that Paul was the Scarborough rapist. She also admitted to their being involved in the deaths of Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, and her own sister, Tammy Homolka. Karla now held the key to putting away one of Canada's most notorious serial rapists and killers. But she would only agree to testify against her husband in exchange for a reduced sentence for herself.
Her attorney began to cut a deal, and that, of course, was of tremendous interest, to all the investigators, being able to shed some direct light on these murders and what was going on.
Karla made a full confession to the police. She confirmed that Paul was the Scarborough rapist and blamed him for the deaths of the 3 girls. She said that Paul had forced her to take part in the attacks against her will. Karla also told them that all the physical proof they needed was in the couple's house on video.
When it came together, it was the aha moment. It's the, it makes perfect sense now. That you could see that escalation, the escalation that we dreaded early on in the Scarborough rapes.
Word quickly spread that there'd been a breakthrough in 3 of Canada's biggest unsolved criminal cases, the Scarborough rapist and the murders of Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey. Police knew they had to move fast before Paul Bernardo tried to make a run for it. On the 17th of February 1993, the police arrested Bernardo. Investigators began searching his Port Dalhousie home.
I will confirm for you this morning that we have obtained the search warrant. We entered the premise and began our work.
During a 71-day search, the police could not find the videotapes which Karla claimed showed the attacks on Leslie, Kristen and Tammy. Karla's word was all the prosecutors had to go on if they wanted to move forward and press charges against Paul Bernardo. Given her extensive knowledge of the crimes and her willingness to testify, Karla's attorney was able to arrange a plea agreement with prosecutors.
They made a deal with Karla Homolka because they had no choice. They did not have direct evidence linking Paul Bernardo to the murder victims.
In exchange for her testimony against her husband, Karla would receive a reduced sentence for her involvement in the murders. The deal was kept secret from the public. The 28th of June 1993, Karla appeared in court to face the charges against her. Although journalists were allowed in the courtroom, they were only allowed to report on the charges and sentence. This restriction was uncommon in Canadian courts and frustrated many reporters.
The publication ban actually spurred the media to write even more about what they didn't know, to write even more about their unanswered questions, and to stir up public indignation about the public right to know being denied.
It suddenly dawned on us how big this case was and how brutal and how awful and how psychologically twisted this case was.
In court, Karla's attorney portrayed her as an abused wife, forced to participate in her husband's criminal activities. Karla was convicted on manslaughter charges stemming from her involvement in the murders of Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey. She received 2 12-year sentences. The terms were to be served concurrently.
She had received what everybody thought was described as the deal of the century. What she had participated in, though, was not generally known publicly.
The light sentence unleashed widespread speculation about a secret plea agreement.
Since her plea was not allowed to be publicized, it was inferred that it must have been a guilty plea.
According to the government, the plea agreement and the full facts of the case were being kept secret to ensure a fair trial for Paul Bernardo. The public was divided about being left in the dark.
Hear no justice, see no justice, speak no justice. The law's an ass.
All we need to know is that justice is served. We don't need to know what the girls went through.
Karla Homolka was sent to Kingston Prison for Women. In August 1993, while in prison, Karla filed for divorce. The next time she'd see Paul was in court, testifying against him. It was then that the full, shocking details of the couple's crimes would be made public.
The interest in this case was not sparked so much by the brutality of the murders. It was essentially fed by disbelief that such an attractive man and such a beautiful young girl could team up and be involved in something so bad. I mean, the Americans coined them Ken and Barbie, and there was something to be said about that.
Ken and Barbie's darkest secrets would soon be revealed when the couple's missing videotapes finally surfaced. The 18th of May 1995, Toronto. Day one of the trial of Paul Bernardo, one of the most anticipated murder trials in Canadian history. People queued for blocks to try and get a seat inside. Scarborough native Paul Bernardo pleaded not guilty to 9 charges in connection with the deaths of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, including kidnapping, unlawful confinement, aggravated sexual assault, and murder. His now ex-wife, Karla Homolka, was already serving time in prison for her role in the crimes. After agreeing to testify against Paul, Karla was serving a 12-year sentence. Inside the courtroom, the day began with some powerful new evidence for prosecutors. 6 videotapes found in the couple's home.
That was the first time that they had direct evidence against not only Paul Bernardo but Karla Homolka.
Much to the court's surprise, the tapes revealed a very different version of events. Karla had misled the authorities about her involvement in the crimes. On the videos, she was seen fully participating in the attacks. Had the tapes surfaced earlier, they could have affected her infamous plea deal.
The tapes were crucial evidence. They were the smoking gun.
On one tape, Karla was seen raping her own sister.
She assaulted her sister, captured on videotape. The idea that one sister would offer up a younger sister as some sort of a present without a gun being held to their head seems bizarre in the extreme. It was absolutely mind-boggling.
In court, the defense maintained that any crimes committed by Bernardo stopped short of murder.
We had this sort of history to work on, that all of his sexual assaults, the women had lived. It was only when he was in this very close interaction with Karla that they didn't. Paul Bernardo insisted right from the beginning, and I'm sure does to this day, that he was not the killer and that Karla was.
On the 19th of June 1995, Karla Homolka went to court to testify against her ex-husband. She told the court that she was a victim and that Bernardo was the mastermind behind all 3 murders. On cross-examination, the defense played the videotapes, which showed Karla's active participation in the assaults. She used battered spouse syndrome as her explanation, a claim sharply disputed by Paul's attorney.
I'm not suggesting for a moment that she was not abused by him. What I'm saying is that she could not be classified as a person suffering from a battered spouse syndrome.
I think in battered spouse syndrome that we're talking about people having tremendous psychological abuse. As I see it, she was more of an accomplice in these horrible crimes than a victim of these crimes.
Paul Bernardo's trial lasted nearly 4 months. In an effort to spare the families more grief, the judge allowed the jury to see the graphic videotapes, while the public was only allowed to hear the audio.
Professionally speaking, I was disappointed that we didn't see the tapes. Personally speaking, I'm glad we didn't see the tapes.
The audio revealed Paul Bernardo's modus operandi as used in the Scarborough rape cases.
He got them to repeat over and over and over again that they'll do anything he wanted, that he's the king.
After hearing the testimony of 86 witnesses, the jury of 8 men and 4 women deliberated for 8 hours before reaching their verdict. The 1st of September 1995, 31-year-old Paul Bernardo was found guilty of all 9 charges against him, including 2 counts of first-degree murder for killing 15-year-old Kristen French and 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey. The parents of both girls were pleased that Bernardo was behind bars, but their nightmare wasn't over.
Only the trial is over. Leslie is still not coming home.
Paul Bernardo was sentenced to life in prison with eligibility for parole in 25 years. After his conviction, he confessed to the manslaughter of Karla's younger sister Tammy and the sexual assaults of 14 other women in the Scarborough area. Those admissions led the judge to declare him a dangerous offender, meaning he'll probably spend the rest of his life in jail without chance of parole.
The controversy sort of rages around, was Karla given too light a sentence? Did she get off on this thing, so to speak, get off way too lightly? And that's certainly the opinion of a lot of folks, that she is. I have my concern that she may be more psychopathic than Paul.
Even though Karla Homolka had misled the authorities about her role in the assaults, prosecutors decided not to challenge the plea agreement. The decision, they said, was final.
I'm not a lawyer, but as I understand the law, once the deal was cut in Canada, they had to honor the deal.
Karla's plea deal became known as one of the worst in Canadian history. The media dubbed it the deal with the devil. The controversy surrounding Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka's crimes did not end with the verdicts. The following year, the Ontario court released the results of a 6-month inquiry into the police's handling of the Paul Bernardo case. They concluded that the investigation was hampered by numerous errors and that Bernardo fell through the cracks simply by moving from one community to another. Since the inquiry, Canadian authorities have implemented a new system for tracking serial predators. Their goal is to improve communication between police departments. On the 4th of July 2005, 35-year-old Karla was released from prison, having served 12 years behind bars. Although she'd served her full sentence, many felt that was not long enough, given the role she'd played in the crimes.
My personal feeling is she got off light. I think that she has more culpability for this than she was punished for. But she's out, and so all we can do now is hope that she doesn't harm anyone else.
Unable to comfortably return to her hometown of St. Catharines, Karla Homolka decided to start again in French-speaking Montreal.
She could come out in Quebec basically an unknown person, and she could get on with her life and become a normal person, and that's exactly what she's tried to do.
Karla says she still has nightmares about the girls and feels remorse for what she did.
She should be scrutinized. She shouldn't just be allowed to, ride off into the sunset.
In February 2007, less than 2 years after her release from prison, Karla Homolka gave birth to a baby boy.
Karla Homolka has a tough life ahead. How do you deal with what happened there? And how on earth is she going to break it to her child? What happened?
She's out there in the community, and so we all, not only for her sake, but for all of our sakes, have to hope that she's going to do well.
From my perspective, she had served her sentence. It was she's entitled to be released, and she's entitled to go about her life as best she can, and that's the way the system is. Would I want her living next door? No.
Did you kill Elizabeth Bain on June the 19th, 1990?
Well, it's a loaded question. I mean,
Are we going to go back and go through the entire sequence of what happened in my life? I mean, I could just give a yes or no answer, but there's a lot of issues about that. Right. Carla's and my role, who did what, where, when. This is why I said to you guys, go down there to get a polygraph to see if she was telling the truth. Why didn't Bevan do it in the first place? I mean, he's polygraphed able as a Camaro. Why would you make a deal with someone and not give them a polygraph? It's not incomprehensible to me. Because now I'm sitting, my file says her version, and it's a lie. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like I'm not making frivolous points here. I mean, and now you're asking me after you said Peel Regional said I'm lying about this, and then you're saying I'm lying about my profile. You're saying I'm lying if I'm better or not. Now you're saying, hey, did you kill this person? I mean, well, you're saying I'm lying here, here, and here. I could say no, I didn't. But I mean, you already said I'm lying here with Peel. You say.
I'm not saying anything about who's lying. I'm simply.
And I've given you directions to go to find the truth.
Right. And I've asked, and again, I've told you that I've done investigation on information that you've told me, and as a result of that information, I've been able to verify in my mind where you told me the truth. So if Peel Region is lying about you or someone else is lying about you, I have no control over that. Or no,
it goes right to credibility.
Well, absolutely it does, and that's, I guess, the easy way that is to, if we can go through, we'll answer the questions, and yes, I hope to be able to go through some timeline to identify where you were, what you were doing specifically in relation to this case.
Anyways, I know I'm giving you guys a hard time about certain things, but I mean, really, I'm a human being, and when you guys do all these things, I've got to, I'll try and truncate it a little bit more, but anyways, the answer to that is no, but the 800-pound gorilla in the room that's a life 25 sentence, It really comes down to credibility, and not only credibility, but then again, timeline. I mean, between what Carla's and my roles were respectively, and this and that. There's points here. I mean, and now you're asking me, after you said Peel Regional said I'm lying about this, and then you're saying I'm lying about my profile, you're saying I'm lying if I'm better or not. Now you're saying, hey, did you kill this person? I mean, well, you're saying I'm lying here, here, and here. I could say, no, I didn't. But I mean, you already said I'm lying here with Peel. You say.
I'm not saying anything about who's lying. I'm simply.
And I've given you directions to go to find the truth.
Right. And I've asked, and again, I've told you that I've done investigation on information that you've told me, and as a result of that information, I've been able to verify in my mind where you told me the truth. So if Peel Region is lying about you or someone else is lying about you, I have no control over that. Or no,
it goes right to credibility.
Well, absolutely it does, and that's, I guess, the easy way that is to, if we can go through, we'll answer the questions, and yes, I hope to be able to go through some timeline to identify where you were, what you were doing specifically in relation to this case.
Anyways, I know I'm giving you guys a hard time about certain things, but I mean, really, I'm a human being, and when you guys do all these things, I've got to, I'll try and truncate it a little bit more, but anyways, the answer to that is no, but the 800-pound gorilla in the room that's a life 25 sentence, It really comes down to credibility, and not only credibility, but then again, timeline. I mean, between what Carla's and my roles were respectively, and this and that.
He used to make me kneel on the floor in the middle of the bedroom, and then he'd stare straight ahead, and he'd walk around me in circles and kick me. And I wasn't allowed to look, so I wouldn't know when it was coming. Well, he raped her when I was there, and I think he made me leave twice.
Why did he make you leave?
I don't know. And now that I look back, I think how stupid. I mean, I should have gone to the police from day one. But my mind was so messed up.
Tonight, The Sun says the convicted murderer, using the name Leanne Teal, gave birth to a 7-pound baby last Saturday at St. Mary's Hospital in Montreal. Apparently, the 36-year-old Homolka and the baby's father took their newborn back to their home on Montreal's South Shore on Monday. Tonight, Homolka's lawyer and her sister are denying the story. Homolka got out of jail a year and a half ago after serving a 12-year sentence for her part in the killings of schoolgirls Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey.